I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. So today, Lee, we're finally getting around to a writer that you've gone on record as saying is the greatest Chinese writer of the 20th century.
That's correct. And I'm still on record for that.
Oh my goodness. Way to stand your ground. Who are we talking about?
We're talking about Zhang Ailing, or Ailing Chang.
Chang.
Ailing, yeah. So that's, in English, it would be E-I-L-E-N and C-H-A-N-G.
Yeah, Ailing Chang. She is the writer of a ton of stuff. A number of film adaptations have been made of her works.
I think the Taiwanese version of her entire collected works runs into about 16, 17, 18 volumes, something like that. She translated an old Shanghaiese story, which is kind of like the classic Shanghai literature piece, into... I think she translated it into Chinese and English.
Yeah, she did her own translations into English, I know.
Yeah.
So what story in particular are we talking about here?
Today we're looking at Love in a Fallen City.
Mm-hmm. And it's a particularly famous one. It's her first one, I believe, right? Or at least her first major story that was published.
I think it's an earlier one. I don't know.
You know if it's first?
I don't know if it's first. It takes place in two separate cities, which are very important to Chinese modernity. Mm-hmm. That starts out in Shanghai and moves to Hong Kong.
Right. But the vast majority of the action takes place in Hong Kong. And the basic shell of the plot is a recent divorcee named Liu Su is taken to Hong Kong.
She's kind of not wanted by her family.
She's not wanted anymore. It's this very large household, and she's simply not wanted there.
Divorced women, just kind of no use for them.
Right. So she's taken to Hong Kong, and there she meets, doesn't meet for the first time, but meets again
in Shanghai,
a wealthy sort of playboy type that she had seen before in Shanghai, and they begin a romance there.
But it's not a particularly deep romance. It's very much he's kind of the playboy, and he's just using her sexually, and she is trying to get something out of this relationship.
But it's interesting and we'll talk about specific details in a second. That's part of the idea, although based on how Zhang Ailing depicts both of them, it's not entirely one-sided. She's quite sharp and knows what she's doing.
Absolutely.
So, and the apex of the story, the last about third, it details the bombing of Hong Kong by the Japanese in 1941.
If I remember correctly, Liu Yuan, who is the male protagonist, the male character, he leaves her, and he's about to leave Hong Kong and leaving Liu Su, just kind of in a lurch. And then suddenly the Japanese attack. And he is driven back to her looking for safety. But they find more than just... They find romance.
He's planning on coming back. He's going to England.
He says he's planning on coming back, but...
Who knows, but
he's going on this long journey to England in the middle of a war. I think there's just kind of this, like...
A lot could be implied. It's not stated explicitly. Anyway, so there's a lot of interesting stuff in this story. I was just reading C.T. Xia, who's one of the creators of modern Chinese literary studies. And I want to say modern Chinese because there's a long tradition of classical Chinese literary studies.
But no one studied modern Chinese literature as a
thing,
in universities until this guy did.
Or at least he was the one who sort of codified it and really began. Anyway, one of the early, the sort of...
grandfather of modern Chinese literature.
Yeah. Makes an interesting comparison. I'm curious what you think about this.
Okay.
Between Zhang Ailing and Jane Austen.
I absolutely think that's great. Zhang Ailing actually has a book where she rewrites the story of not Jane Austen, but Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre. Mm-hmm. So she has a rewriting of Jane Eyre. And Zhang Ailing is incredibly familiar with English, both as a language and as a literature. My understanding is her mother was bilingual to the point that when she gave Zhang Ailing her name, Ailing Chang, she actually gave her her English name first.
Interesting.
Rather than her Chinese name.
Huh.
But I'm not entirely sure of that, but I have at least heard that rumor, and I think it's indicative of how integrated she is into writing stuff that has a kind of modern flavor.
So what do you see in this story, or perhaps in other stories you've read, but particularly this one, that reminds you of Jane Austen? Or might inspire some kind of comparison?
She's a female writer who's writing about very realistic. She's writing in a very realistic manner, and she's writing about kind of everyday quotidian concerns. But more than that, I think for me, Jane Austen, the thing that I get out of both Jane Austen and Zhang Ailing is this rejection of any sort of political thing, any need to have a political reading, which is in itself, of course, a political reading. Mm-hmm. But for Jane Austen, you've got this woman who's writing during the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and male characters are essentially kind of tertiary.
To some extent, or secondary.
Yeah, they're secondary characters. I mean, there are some guys passing through who have military uniforms on, but the thing that Jane Austen is writing against is that a novel has to be about war. You know, all great novels have to be about great wars.
Right.
Jane Austen said no. I'm not going to talk about war. In fact, when war comes in, it's just going to be like it's only going to be kind of a side conversation for what's really going on, which is these women's concern about love and marriage, which is the focus of most of Jane Austen's characters.
And there's also an element that I see of, there's a lot more positivity in both Zhang Ailing and Jane Austen than other sort of...
What do you mean positivity?
Well, Zhang Ailing's characters are grappling with certain social concerns. I'm thinking of, when I'm making a comparison in my mind between Jane Austen and the French writer Georges Sand, who's similar. She's also writing about women's concerns, but in a far more pessimistic way.
Okay.
Depicting broken marriages and unhappy relationships and people who are women who are trying to flee and get away from things. And Jane Austen's characters frequently find what it is they want.
Yep.
They get married. They have love. And in Zhang Ailing, this story in particular, this is in fact what happens.
It's mostly a happy story, though generally Zhang Ailing's stories are quite sad.
Okay. I don't have as much experience with Zhang Ailing's Lee.
But I think you're onto something. Like, both Jane Austen and Zhang Ailing are reading, they're rejecting sort of political criticism or like a need for politicization of literature. Like, talking about the world of women is not only okay, but it's also the subject matter of great literary works. And that in itself is a very, like, political statement, but it's also a very kind of feminist statement in that women's worlds, as circumscribed as they were in those days, they can be the subject of great literature. It's not just great men who are the subject of great history and great literature, but great, not great women. These aren't great women that she's writing about.
These are women.
These are just regular women. And one of the things that I like so much about Zhang Ailing is that she's rejecting this May 4th narrative that we've talked about on previous podcasts. The May 4th had to be about the nation. It had to be about the political. But Zhang Ailing is saying no. And what's interesting, so before we were podcasting, we talked about this a little. You know, when you read it, you didn't notice this until the end, but the word, so it's about, the Japanese attack on Hong Kong is an incredibly important event in this novel. It's probably the most important event in the whole novel. But the word Japan is not mentioned once in the whole novel.
Or Japanese.
Nothing. And the May 4th reading and the sort of communist reading is, we should be fighting those Japanese. It should be a very nationalistic thing. But Zhang Ailing resists nationalism. She doesn't care about nationalism. She is focused only on these two individuals and love, and their love, and this kind of very, I would suggest, a very personal, a very democratic literature. It's not about the state. It's
Yeah.
about the individual.
And that's that's the thing I enjoyed about the story. I'm always going to be more partial to the political stuff, mostly because that's what I sort of cut my teeth on. But it is striking reading this novel alongside some of the others from that era, which are far more grim. It's like reading Emile Zola or somebody.
And they're far more boring, too, right?
I don't know. I enjoy some of those. But having said that, I can understand why, to this day, Zhang Ailing is still highly read in China.
And whether or not you can enjoy those more political authors, certainly no one is as well read as read as much as Zhang Ailing.
Yeah, there's not people, queuing up to make a movie remake of Camel Xiangzi by Lao She, even though it's a great book.
And Zhang Ailing has had so many films made about her books. But here's something that's interesting. So in China, every writer has a museum, right? And I'm sort of a museum. It's my thing. I do museums.
Yeah.
So every writer has a museum, not just Lucian. Lucian has multiple.
Yeah, Lucian's got a museum everywhere.
Yeah, but interestingly, the one writer who doesn't have a museum, Zhang Ailing does not have a museum. She's the most popular. Whether or not you think she's the greatest writer, she's the most popular writer of the in Chinese in the 20th century. But she doesn't have a museum.
Maybe it's because she doesn't need one.
So they actually had a cafe in Shanghai focused on her that functioned as a sort of, not underground museum, but a semi-museum. And they actually, apparently, were told by the commies that they had to tone it down and pull back on the Zhang Ailing. Because what Zhang Ailing is doing is totally political, and it's anti-communist as it gets. By not being political, it is incredibly political.
And it is interesting because, to bring us back to this story in particular, it's fascinating to read about this seminal event with no mention of the people involved. The entire event is seen through the eyes of the protagonist, and I mean really through the eyes of the protagonist. She's not looking into the street and saying, "Oh my goodness, that must be the Japanese." She literally sees craters from the bombs. She sees walls caving in. She sees people running, and that's the limit of what she's noticing in that moment. The author does not then superimpose on top of that. Now, of course, if Liu Su had known a little more, she would have known this was the evil Japanese, which would have made the book a classic from the 1930s and 40s.
And incredibly boring.
Possibly more boring as well. Although, interesting, why would it make it more boring to know that they were the Japanese?
Because I think it takes away from the main tension of the novel, which is the focus on the individuals involved. And their feelings, their qing, the ganqing, the like emotional involvement. By the political there is a real loss that you have when you focus on the political.
It is true. There are very few novels that are able to balance those two, like a focus on social political forces and then also inner lives of individuals. It's very, very hard to focus that.
And to bring it back to Jane Austen, she rejects that sort of need to talk about the political.
So, for me, the moment in this book that sticks out, and probably for most people, is the Japanese attack on Hong Kong. But what's striking to me about that is, how short the episode actually is. It's only about 2 or 3 pages of the actual attack. The aftermath occupies another 2 or so, and then we have sort of a page or 2 ending where the two lovers are reunited and all of that. Not reunited, but they finish happily. And what was striking to me is after the attack is over, an attack which, as we've mentioned, has no named culprits, Liu Su and Liu Yuan, the protagonists, are in what amounts to a bomb shelter. Not really, it's an old restaurant of some kind. And Liu Su reflects to herself that you cannot rely on anything. All institutions, all states, all governments, everything can and will be destroyed. The only thing that's real is this connection to another person. And the sentence that follows that observation, she holds Liu Yuan and is comforted by his physical presence. And while that's kind of the stuff of romance, in this context, And in the context of modern Chinese literature, it's very provocative because in the 1930s, when the Japanese presence was certainly very, very strong in China.
And she's writing this, I believe she's writing this either during the Japanese occupation of much of China or shortly thereafter.
Yeah, it would have been shortly after. Because,
what year is it?
Well, in the book, it talks about 1941, so she would have had to have written it after that.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Like either during the occupation. So was it before 40?
Well, the anti-Japanese movement was in the 1930s. That's when literature starts moving sort of self-consciously in that direction in China. But again, by saying all institutions fail, that includes communism. That includes democracy.
Any ideology, really.
Any ideology except this thing right here.
And what is that thing?
Well, in this novel, it's love.
Yeah. And I think there's something going on there. This focus on love, where in Chinese it would be qing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually in the title of the work, the Chinese title. And that idea of qing is something that is incredibly. It has a very. It's very closely linked to stuff that we've talked about before, and we'll hopefully talk about later. Is Ming-Qing literature. Now, this Qing, Ming-Qing, Qing is different from the Qing that we're talking about. Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty literature are very focused on Qing, which is sometimes translated as love, but also as a kind of just feeling, something like that. But so Zhang Ailing is, we've talked about how she is like channeling Jane Austen. I don't want to make her sound like she's not really a kind of author who's focused on native Chinese things. In fact, the language that she uses is it's an older style that she's writing in. It's a little bit more difficult to understand in some ways than Lu Xun and some of the May 4th writers, but in some ways it's easier to understand, particularly for Chinese readers, because it totally connects with these other novels, the Hong Lou Meng, The Dream of the Red Chamber. She's drawing off of that kind of literary tradition, which is interesting, and it's also another kind of political move, right? Like, not only is she stating that, yes, I am part of this Chinese tradition that comes out of the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty, but she's also rejecting this May 4th narrative, which is, I mean, Lu Xun was trying to cut himself off from anything. He said everything old is bad. Everything old in China is bad. Let's destroy the old stuff. Zhang Ailing's not saying that. She's saying the exact opposite. She's saying, actually, this old stuff, this old Chinese stuff, we can, this is great stuff. There's something to build off here.
Yeah. And I think that's possible. You mentioned this in another podcast. Maybe one reason why she's still as popular as she is.
Whereas Lu Xun, he's not popular so much as very much a state-supported author.
It depends in what circles you're talking about popular. By popular, you mean like the average sort of person going into a bookstore to buy a book. They're not going to go in and buy Lu Xun.
Yeah, I mean that as popular.
Yeah. So, again, this is an interesting perspective on political events because she's sort of talking about everything in the abstract. There are bombs, but it doesn't matter.
Except for love.
Yeah, except for love. And even that, it's interesting because it's not the institution of marriage, even though that's something that Liu Su wants throughout the book. Their first encounter, Liu Su and Liu Yuan in Hong Kong, is very much one of just passion. It's not they're not going through the formal courtship maneuver. They're going out, they're going for long walks on the beach, unchaperoned evenings out in the town. It's this sort of whirlwind, exciting romance. It's a very
worldly kind of romance.
It's a very worldly romance. The kind of romance which, incidentally, would have caused, a Huaben to explode. Like these Ming-Qing short stories, there was always a price to be paid for particularly a woman who is not in her place.
So I think in a sort of moral sense, she has definitely incorporated this westernized universe. I mean, she's writing, it's being written about Hong Kong, which is a city, can't point this out enough, it's a city under British colonialism at the time. So to a certain degree, Western mores are accepted.
Yeah. And to some extent, really, that could explain a lot of her popularity, is that she's bringing to bear this sort of high romantic sensibility to traditional Huabun narratives. Maybe not Huabun, but a short story form that Chinese readers would be used to. But imagine if the sort of shackles, if you want to think of it that way, of Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism, it would have been in the Mingqing. Imagine those were gone, and instead 2 people were rewarded for their dedication to each other, outside of the social approval of marriage.
So I'm going to throw this kind of long pass to you and see if it lands. So I'm teaching Chinese popular culture right now, and we are looking at popular music. And one of the things our Professor Chan, who's we both had and highly respect, one of the things he said is that, America created popular music partially because it has this mix of things, this kind of cocktail of different traditions coming together that creates something that's totally new and that you can't really get anywhere else. So the example is like contemporary popular music is essentially these traditional kinds of Western, quote unquote, Western music, European music, classical music. You can think of that, but it's kind of where that meets this Jewish traditional music, which is its own very well-developed independent tradition, and where it collides with African American music, and all of that comes together to create this thing that we now call pop music. What I would suggest is that you can think of Zhang Ailing as one of the reasons she's so great and so beloved today is because she's melding these 2 completely separate traditions. That is the Western tradition, the tradition of English literature, which she knows so well. She read from a very young age. But she's also simultaneously reading these classic works of Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty fiction. I'm thinking specifically of Jingping Mei and Hong Lomeng. Hong Lomeng, she definitely was very familiar with.
For sure.
And she's combining those into something that's incredibly new, and that it's not just the freshness, because the freshness eventually wears off 50 years later. But Zhang Ailing no one's kind of betting against her. She's not wearing off. She is still incredibly popular, and I think that what we see is this artist taking 2 distinct traditions, mixing them together, coming up with this very incredibly beautiful sense of language, plot, and just kind of kicking butt.
Zhang Ailing is pop star. I can kind of see that.
But she is a pop star. I mean, like she functions as a pop star. The way her fans work, there is a sort of pop star element.
It's true. That is true. Yeah. So, final thoughts. That's about all I have on this one.
I think I don't know. Like, I love Zhang Ailing. I think there's more to talk about, but I think we've kind of summed it up.
I think we have to. We'll probably come back to more of hers later. She's written so much, it would be silly not to talk about more stories. But this one is remarkable for me, like I say, because of the way it treats of things like war, political violence from afar, if at all, and the way it treats of other things like personal interactions as the ultimate expression of reality. That beyond these things, everything else is illusory, which is very much counter to the writing happening in that period.
And we should point out before we go that there is a very good English translation of this. We'll link to it.
Okay, sounds good. Well, that's all I've got.
Okay. I'm Lee Moore.
And I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.